Have you ever noticed that salty snacks are usually cheaper than the drinks that you need to go with the salty snacks? I'm a cheap person, so when I go places, movie theaters, etc., I normally just sneak my own stuff in. But when I am forced to buy stuff, and even sometimes they'll even give it away for free. Even airlines, they'll do, here's these free things, here's these cheap things. And the reason is your dry mouth is willing to pay $7 for a small cup of lemonade more than your kind of hungry stomach is willing to pay $7 for snacks. So they figured this out. If they're ready to, I'm missing my clicker, so somebody can track that down for me, that'd be great. If you're ready to pay that $7, ideally, actually, what would happen is they'd sell you a drink that has high sodium in it. So then you have to keep buying them, right? What happens is marketers have figured out that the thirst is actually more of a motivator than a little bit of hunger. You can put off hungriness. The thirst, it feels so immediate. You have to have it. You have to have what it is you're thirsting for. And even if you can't get that, you're going to try to get something close. It's just human nature. It's this survival instinct we have. Marketers have figured out that'll drive us to action. And so, when you have a thirst for something to change, when you're parched because you've gone through a season of taking on too much and you're feeling drained, that salt is just pulling all the life from you and all the liquid from you, you're dehydrated, what do you do? And obviously, physically, we're going to go find a drink, but what about spiritually? What about emotionally? What about mentally? What about when your life is just pulled away and you've had to take so much in and you've ingested so much salt of the world, of life? It's pulled so much from you. Where do you go? Now, it can't just be anywhere. It can't just be anywhere because we have a tendency to find things that are just worsening the problem, right? We just find salty things to drink, and maybe that will help us. Maybe we would go find salt water, right? And what does that do? It doesn't help our thirst. It just actually brings death. But when you're feeling desperate, some of those things that even will bring death look enticing. Where can you go? We've spent a number of weeks here and just a few weeks in Deuteronomy. And what I'm hoping to see here at the end of this morning is that you recognize the Bible is leading us to the answer. That we go through life, that we get thirsty, that we have need. And even some of that it's not bad. It's not bad to have need. A lot of times what happens is I'm in a situation and I recognize that it could be better. And that thirst for better, that thirst for something good is what's driving me. And sometimes when I don't know what I'm doing, drives me the wrong direction. Deuteronomy, as we're going to see here in Moses' last hours, is driving us towards this point that there is an answer. That thirst can be answered. If you've gotten a little bit familiar with Deuteronomy over this time, I'm hoping that we're leaving Deuteronomy with a little bit of an idea, that you're like, I kind of get it. I get what's happening here. That the structure that we've laid out here, it's chiastic, right? It's a chiasm, which means that it kind of comes to a point. In fact, the whole Pentateuch, I think, is a chiasm. If you were to take all the chapters of all the books of the first 5 books of the Bible and lay them out, they would chiastically come to a singular point that it's focused on, which would be in Leviticus 16. The Passover lamb. That this whole law, this whole thing God's doing, the whole thing he's putting forward is to prove that people can be forgiven with a sacrificial love. Now, Deuteronomy, within that whole chiasm, has its own little chiasm. That you look at the red, right? Israel's history and Israel's future. And we're going to be down in that bottom red this morning. That future of Israel, where they're going now, matters. He's setting up the story. Now, what we've seen throughout the whole book, though, is that it focused down on these 10 commandments being lived out in real life. There's stipulations that God, looking at Israel, says, okay, I want you to be my people. I want to engage in this relationship with you. There's a promise that I'm making. That I'm going to be this God, you're going to be this people. If you obey me, you'll have life in the land. And if you disobey me, if you break the promise, then you're going to have death in the land. That's what this agreement is. And the first generation of Israel that came out of the desert wouldn't do it. They wouldn't walk in trust. They wouldn't walk in faith. And so he had them take a lap. 40 years later, they come back, and now they're here at the edge of the promised land again. And he says, if you go in and you obey and you live the way you ought, if you follow my law, if life goes the way it's supposed to, you're going to have life in the land. But if you walk away from me, if you don't follow all these stipulations of the promise, if it isn't truly your heart, then you're going to find death in the land. And there's not much to look forward to. And the people say, yeah, we're going to do that. We're going to do that. Now, coming up to this point of like having a promised relationship with God, there's kind of a backlog to the story, right? I mean, there's other books that came before. What happened was God created everything, and he said, I have a design for this. This is supposed to work a certain way. And then when we introduced sin into that, we just poured a bunch of sand into the gears of creation. Now there's all this friction, and there's this tension, and things are snapping and breaking and grinding. Things are not working the way they ought to. And it increasingly gets worse and worse. It increasingly, death seeps in. The more we're attached to sin, the more death is there. But God says, I don't want it to stay like that. I want to restore this. I want to fix it. I want to redeem it. And so he says, I'm going to send somebody to do that. Now, who is this person? Out of Israel, he decides, I'm going to choose Israel, and this is going to be the vehicle. Through this vehicle, this nation, we're going to find this Messiah, this one who's going to fix this. And yet the people of Israel continue to reject him. So coming into Deuteronomy, we're going, all right, we need this to work because we need an answer for all these problems. We need like a hope to kind of connect in. And they have this deal set in front of them now, life in the land or death in the land. Are you going to pursue this Messiah? Are you going to try to find this answer or not? They've been led by Moses for a long time out of Egypt, and now in these final chapters, we see that he's not going to lead them much longer. He's not going to lead. Look, Deuteronomy, we're going to be in Deuteronomy 31 through 34. And in the first two verses of Deuteronomy 31, he says, Then Moses went out and spoke these words to all Israel. I am now 120 years old, and I am no longer able to lead you. Moses is going to die outside the land. Now here's where I want to kind of hurry us along, because we're going to come back to Moses. So just pin that in your brain. I want to move on to this next point kind of quick. When we come back to Moses, we will come back to Moses, but the next part in this chapter, Moses lays out for them something pretty sad. Moses wrote down this law and gave it to the Levitical priests who carried the ark. Now, the law, when it talks about that, is the whole law. I think this is referring to the first 5 books of the Bible. He's saying he finished this up. He's got this whole thing. He gives it to the priests. The priests are going to take it. They're going to put it on in their kind of sacred objects that they're going to carry around with them. And they carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord and to all the elders of Israel. Then Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, in the year for canceling debts, during the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you shall read this law before them in their hearing. Now, this is why it's kind of going to get a little ominous. Moses says, I'm going to die. Then he moves from there into, I actually have a task for you guys. Every 7 years, you all get together, you have this big feast. I'm talking to everybody. Like everybody comes. And every 7 years, it's the release of the debts. We talked about that a few weeks ago. How slaves would be released from their debts, that people would be set free, that the debt you owed as your neighbor is forgiven. This is a big deal, right? I mean, a pretty big celebration. And then you'd have this Feast of Tabernacles, what we would call ingathering, right? We're familiar with that term here. There's this celebration, and we're bringing stuff to God, and we're going to be together, and we would build these little kind of like tents, these little huts, and we would live in them. We kind of camp for a week, kind of like a NASCAR-style celebration out here, right? And they're out there for a week feasting and celebrating. He says, this is what I want you to do. When you all get together, I want you to read the whole law. Right? Which I calculated it would take between, I don't know, maybe 12, 13 hours for you to sit down and read aloud. And so you're going to spend 2, maybe 3 hours a day all together just reading the law. The stories, the stipulations, the covenants, reminding you what should have happened, how you've fallen down. You're going to do this. Every 7 years, you all get together and do this. So I want you to hold that kind of picture in your mind. Okay, I'm pinning things in your brain. You have Moses is going to die. We'll come back to that. And now you have this image of all of Israel. I'm talking millions of people descending into this one place to feast and to hear the word. The rest of chapter 31, God explains to Moses, and Moses explains to the people that God knows they will fail. This is kind of a bummer. Kind of the last things that he says to them in coming into 16 and 17. Then the Lord said to Moses, you're going to rest with your ancestors, and these people will soon prostitute themselves to foreign gods of the land they're entering. They will forsake me and break the covenant I made with them. And in that day, I will become angry with them and forsake them. I will hide my face from them, and they will be destroyed. That's just a taste. The whole passage is longer. He goes on about how it's going to all happen. And it's like really sad. It's this really terrible thing that God's going to punish them. And then when they're going to cry out and they're going to be, he's not even going to look at them. I won't even look. Because I've laid this out, I've given this to you, and I've called you into this, and I've given you everything you need, and you don't have a repentant heart. You won't turn to me. And you're like, wow, that's heavy. So then God spends all of chapter 32 having Moses write a song. And it's a banger, all right? This song it's a bop. It's just makes you want to dance, all right? This song, and he tells them, I'm writing this song so that it'll convict them. This song is going to stand as a witness. It's going to show them how badly they failed. It's an I told you so song. We have songs like that. Do you know that? Can you think of any? How about this one? You better watch out. Better not cry. You better not pout. I'm telling you why. Santa Claus is coming. Wow. Yeah, he's coming to town. Watch out. Think about that song for a second. He's going to get you, kids. That song is a song about impending judgment. That's what that is, right? It's like, hey, if you don't watch it, you're going to wake up Christmas morning, and no presents are going to be there. And the thing that's going to come across your head, come across your mind, come across it, you're going to go, I wasn't good for goodness sake. I didn't do it. It's this song of reminding about judgment. Here's something really interesting about this song. You can read through it. It's pretty bleak. But God is referred to in this passage as the rock. Right? That's where Dwayne got it. But he's this rock, it's a really interesting term because it's not often so repeated in such a condensed way. People usually, you go to the Psalms, they talk about God being the rock, and it's a sense of provision and a foundation. But here God is referring to himself as the rock, and then he talks about, well, I'll just show you. Verse 4, it says, he is the rock. His works are perfect and his ways are just, a faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he. He made him, he's talking about Israel. So he's saying God made Israel ride on the heights of the land and fed him with the fruit of the fields. He nourished him with honey from the rock and with oil from the flinty rock. Okay, keep that image in your mind. Pin that in there. We're going to come back. In verse 18, again he says, you deserted the rock who fathered you. You forgot the God who gave you birth. So there's this number, and there's a number of others in there, but I picked those few. You get the point. God's referring to himself as this rock that has cared for and birthed and nourished and protected and is the foundation of Israel. This is what he wants them to remember. Remember this song. You better watch out. Okay? Keep this in your mind. And as you sing this, you're going to continually think of God as the rock. You're going to continually remember that he said you're going to fall away and the rock's going to bring justice. You're thinking this again and again. And after a long, scary song about judgment and wrath, God gets to the last few verses of this. And it sort of ends the song by saying, where are all these false gods that you worshiped? Where are they to save you now? Right? God's pouring out judgment and being like, where are all those gods you worship now? Who's going to save you from this now? And then it's like he stands up. It's almost like God stands up and says, I'll do it. I'll save you. I'll be the one. I'll restore you. I'll provide justice and payment for your sins. Listen, verse 42 of chapter 32, he says, rejoice, you nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants. He will take vengeance on his enemies and make atonement for his land and people. So after all this judgment, all this, you better watch out. After all of that, again and again, he gets to this last point, and Israel is sitting there singing this song to themselves, and really historically, you can think of it as they're watching their city burn down. Right? They're being conquered by other nations. They're being dragged into slavery. They're being subdued. They're having plagues. They're having famine. And in the midst of all these horrible things that are being poured out because of, back in Deuteronomy 28, when they said, we're going to follow you. And God said, if you don't, you're going to have death in the land. Right? And so they don't follow him. They're having death in the land. These terrible things are happening. And in the song, they're singing, yeah, the rock said this would happen. But there's the last line of the song. Promises something more. Promises that he's going to rescue us from it. So if you can think about that giant state fair. Remember, we're coming back to this, okay? Giant NASCAR get together. Everybody's there camping out. We've all been reading the whole Pentateuch together. It's the last day. It's the last day of the festival. This is a big day. And we've just finished reading Deuteronomy. So this song is fresh in your mind. This verse about God coming in to rescue is fresh in your mind. I want you to imagine what it would feel like to then have someone tell you that they are the fulfillment of that. Like if you're there in a nation that's under slavery and things are not going well for you and you hear this song, oh yeah, I've grown up my whole life hearing that song. Santa Claus is coming to town. Sure he is. Fast forward with me 1,400 years from this point where Moses writes this song into the Gospel of John, where John's telling about Jesus. And this is John 7, verses 37 through 41. He says, on the last and greatest day of the festival, that's this festival, the feast, right? The ingathering, the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, again, probably right after finishing reading that song together, singing it probably, he says, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them. And by this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. Up to that time, the Spirit had not been given, since Jesus had not been glorified. On hearing his words, some of the people said, surely this man is a prophet. And others said, he is the Messiah. Some of them got it. You see that? Some of them recognize exactly what he's saying. He's the rock. This whole rock we were just talking about, this whole thing is here. He's the fulfillment. God gave us spiritual safety and spiritual salvation in this person. Now, we know the rock as this physical thing, that physically water came from the rock. You guys remember that story? Moses was supposed to talk to the rock. Instead, he hit it. They all needed water, and out of this rock came water. God's providing physical salvation in their physical land from the physical rock. And now Jesus shows up and says, I'm the rock. I'm the spiritual salvation to your spiritual thirst. If you really want to live, if you really want true life, come to me. And you're like, Noah, that seems like a stretch. It feels like you're making this up. I'm not. 1 Corinthians 10, Paul attributes this title of Yahweh as the rock to Christ. Listen, verses 3 and 4. He's talking about Israel wandering the desert. He says, they all ate the same spiritual food, talking about manna. They all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. And then we work through the book of John, and Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. What is he saying? Remember how Moses gave you physical bread, manna that showed up miraculously to save you physically? I'm the spiritual salvation. I'm the bread of life. That was the bread that helped your hunger in that moment. This is the bread that sustains you forever. Remember how Moses was used to get that rock open and water came out? That was a physical salvation of thirst, and here's a spiritual thirst that I can quench. He is the rock. Paul's connecting these dots that Yahweh is the rock who protected them and founded them and cared for them. And Paul says, look, Jesus is the rock. Jesus is the Messiah, God himself, coming to fulfill all what we really need. And so if you're like me, when I'm writing this sermon, I'm like, why am I connecting all these dots? What am I doing here? Where is this going? Why does this matter? Why is all this happening? We have God doing all this stuff, and we have all this law, right? And then Deuteronomy bringing to the forefront, hey, do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this. We fast forward to Jesus. Jesus is like, I fulfill the law. So this law is good. We just spent a whole bunch of weeks talking about Deuteronomy and the law and how God's heart is in it and how it shows us good things. We get to Jesus, and he's like, don't keep the law. You don't need to keep the law. You're not under the law. So why do we have the law to begin with? Why did God give this law at all? That's a great question. I really appreciate you asking. It helps me with my sermon. Paul asks that same question in Galatians 3. In chapter 3, verse 19, he says, why then was the law given at all? He says it was added because of the transgressions, until the seed, talking about the promised one, to whom the promise was referred, had come. Let me show you what this means. God creates the world, we introduce sin and death, and things start breaking down real fast. Like think about Noah, right? Why did he make the ark? It said because God had enough. Sin had gotten so bad, evil had taken over so much, that he's like, we can't do this. I'm not doing this anymore. And he restarts. And then the first thing he gives them is law. He says, now there's a death penalty. There's something that will limit the evil. Right? You ever notice how when kids misbehave, you add more rules? Right? If things are going well, you really don't just add rules for fun. And so he says, why did the law come along? Well, it came along as this protection. It came along to guard us, to babysit us, because if we didn't have these parameters, everything would fall apart, and then there would be no place for this person to come and rescue. We need Israel to exist, right? Because that's where the Messiah is coming out of. Well, what happens if Israel gets so wicked and evil it destroys itself? So he gives the law to guard them, to bring them to a place where now the Messiah is here who can fulfill it all and can save us. The law was given to us as a help. We needed the law until Jesus came. That's what it says. Because of transgression, because we kept adding more and more sin until the Son came. Look in a couple verses later. He says, so the law was our guardian until Christ came that we might be justified by faith. Now that is faith. Now that this faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. So in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. Now, give me just a second. I'm going to explain a piece of this. You have seen this become true in your own life. You have seen that where it says the law was our guardian until Christ came. This law, this concept, like a standard of goodness, we go, man, it would really be great if life was like this. When we think about goodness and we think about holiness, we think about justice, and it's way up here, we actually really like it. We want to be the kind of person that's just. We want to be the kind of person that's loving. We want to be the kind of person that's caring. We want to be the kind of person that's trustworthy. We want to be up here. And so by looking at the law, it sort of creates in us this thirst. I want that. And I want that from you. Like, I want you to be that kind of person. Because if everybody in here was 100% trustworthy and 100% pure and 100% like looking out for one another and sacrificial, things would go real good, right? So we hear this and we're like, man, I want to be that. And so then we go, okay, I'm going to buckle down and do it. I'm just going to be more disciplined. I'm going to be kinder. I'm going to be gentle, We're just going to do it. But then Christ says, look, you're not a law follower. Like by identity, that's not who I made you to be. That's not this. He says, I'm going to actually pull that away from you. Did you notice this whole book, whole of Deuteronomy, the promise that they have, if you follow my law, I will give you life in the land. If you do what you're supposed to do, you'll have life in the land. If you have my heart and you walk these commands out, you'll have life in the land. None of this was life eternal. It doesn't talk about the resurrection of your body. It doesn't talk about going to an eternal resting. It doesn't talk about a new heaven and a new earth. The law is a promise that if you lived the right way, it would produce this good life. But it doesn't actually save your soul. And so the protection, the guardianship, the way the law carries us along further and allows humanity to exist without completely eating itself means we're ready for when the Messiah says, I'm the spiritual salvation. This was enough of a physical salvation that you would have life in the land, and then the Messiah would come and would solve this. It would bring salvation in a real way. Here's the point. You look at all the things you want to be, and then you say, I'm just going to try harder, and I'm just going to do more, and I'm just going to be. And he says, you're not designed to be a law follower. It's chugging seawater. You know that I want this, but I can't get myself there. I can't allow myself the identity to be there. Look, this is what he says. So in Christ Jesus, you're all children of God through faith. It doesn't say, so by yourself, you made it through obedience. By yourself, you became good enough because you checked the box. He says, in Christ Jesus, you're children of God through faith. That's been the goal, that God would bring you from a distant place into his family. The goodness that the law talks about that we want creates this thirst, and then we go, man, if I really want to be that, it's not something that I can do, it's someone I have to be. Like, I need God to change me. And then this path becomes this progressive work through us. Not by this like sheer, I'm going to buckle down and do it, but through faith. So here's what happens. Come to the water that gives you life. Instead of going to the water that creates more thirst. We ask, where do we go when things are falling down and you're desperate? And where do we go? How can we fix this? You go to the place where the water gives you life. Not salt water. Not try hard. Not just, I'm just going to do a little bit better. I'm going to be a better law follower, and then I'll just try to get life in kind of this little land. That will allow you to not completely die, I suppose. But it won't make you a child of God. It's the child of God that's given life. And as it progressively works itself out, the thirst that we have to see God's world restored, that's what we see in the world as like progress. We see, I'll give you an example, okay? We build a hospital. What is that? It's us going like, I really hate that there's people who aren't having care given and they need it. We build an orphanage, right? We plant churches in places where they're under threat of death. We buckle down to make sure Bibles are translated. We reach out and we restore the dignity of people who have been taken by the sex trade. We establish ourselves as a beacon for hope for the poor and the needy. We establish theological training centers. What are these things? They're like, well, those are good things. Okay, they come from a place where we go, I have this thirst that the goodness of God would just be worked out in us. So on a macro level, we can see that that's true, right? That we all get together and we go, man, I really feel like we need to do this. Like this is a change that we could have in the world. But then even that progressive little walk towards the goodness of God, we read the law and we're like, man, it really would be good if people were just dedicated. If people just like loved God. And so then on a micro scale, we see this as true because the progressive like goodness of God, what we see reflected out of the law is I'm going to carve out time to do that. And it's not because I'm buckling down and I'm going to earn this badge. No, I'm not earning a badge. I'm wearing a uniform. It says I'm clothed in Christ. Like this is just who I am now. We just saying that I'm a child of God. That's who I am. And as I live in that identity, the thirst I have to see God's world be fixed is what I walk out in faith. I'm like, I want to see that goodness. Like I want to see it out there. That's how we make movements in the world that change the world. And we say, I want to see it in my own life, and that's how we take legitimate steps forward. I'm not saying like, okay, now you have to read the Bible for an hour a day. What about 5 minutes? Legitimate steps towards closing that gap. I don't think you have to solve every mental health crisis in the world, but what about taking your own pretty seriously? I think there's going to be a lot of orphans that never get loved, but what about the ones that we have in our reach? Right? Legitimate steps where we go, the goodness of God, I'm thirsty for that. Like I need to see it. And so I come to the place where real water will give me real life and won't create thirst. Because our natural reaction is to go to salt water. It's to try harder. And it creates this, it's a losing gamble. You stare in the mirror and you tell yourself, I'm going to do better. And I'm going to try harder. But what you're doing, think about this. You're saying, you're placing a bet. You're taking your own self-worth, your own value, your own dignity, and you're betting it. I bet that I can prove that. I bet that the way I live, I'm going to be able to prove how much dignity I have. I'm going to prove how valuable I am. And then you lose. It's just chugging seawater. Don't do that. Don't give into that because you can't work hard enough or feel bad enough or pay enough penance. You can't become the kind of person that would say, I've finally validated myself. I finally justified myself. I finally crossed the line to prove that I'm good enough. You're looking to cross that finish line, but what you end up learning is that you just can't. And now you bet your whole self-worth on it. You fail. And it proves to you, in your own mind, whether it's subconscious or you say it out loud, I'm the problem. I guess the problem is me. I guess I'm just not who I need to be. Listen, the do it better mentality, right? The methodology that's just like, just do it better is chugging salt water. It will only get you thirstier because you're getting farther away from God. It's killing you. And Paul gives us a better answer in these verses. He explains that in this passage in Galatians that we are justified by what Jesus has done. I'm validated because he's done what I couldn't do. I'm validated, I'm justified. The change that comes in me is not from me trying to be different. It's that Jesus already is different. And he's going to change me. He's going to transform me. So I don't have to be crushed by this expectation to perform. My identity isn't in that. My safety isn't in that. No, I'm being shepherded to walk increasingly in my identity as a child of God. That doesn't mean I don't mess up. It doesn't mean I'm not going to trip. But that identity already belongs to me. And there's parts of it I need to grow into. But I am a child of God. I am accepted. I am validated. I am justified by who he is, not by what I produce. So I'm not concerned with those badges. Because like I said, I'm wearing his uniform. I'm clothed in Jesus. So look, we read through Deuteronomy. And a lot of it seems ridiculously foreign to us. But then pieces of this start to make us thirsty for what we're missing. Wouldn't it be great if your relationships really were just pure? Like if you didn't have to second guess people or intentions? If God was just that close to you? Wouldn't this be a great thing that things weren't broken and things were balanced? And we go like, yeah, I actually really do want that. We're thirsty for a healthy life that replaces all this brokenness. There's an old movie called Mutiny on the Bounty, right? It's a classic. And this guy, it's actually based on a really old novel, but the story is late 1700s. There's a ship coming from His Royalty's Majesty's Army, whatever you say, the Navy of the King of England, right? So they have this ship, this merchant ship. And there's a wicked captain. And the number 2 guy can't stand him. And the wicked captain ends up, because of poor choices, he rations out the water. Now his crew is so thirsty, they're starting to go crazy. And there's one guy who actually is found very, very, very sick, and they discover that he's been sneaking salt water. He's been secretly drinking this salt water, and it's brought him to the point where he's almost dead. And I think we have little stashes of seawater. Little things, little places, little relationships where we use this as an excuse that we say, well, this is going to help me. This is going to cure my thirst. This is going to be really what I need. But what we're doing is we're coming back to a place of brokenness. We're giving into something that takes life from us. We need to come to the water that gives life. When Jesus stands up and says, I have the Spirit to give you. I have a life that will flow. That's why Jesus' offer means so much. He's the rock. He's the water that pours out. You think about this when he died, when he was on the cross, and they stabbed him. It was water that poured out. Water and blood. That he was the miracle we needed. That the stone that rolled away was a stone that rolled to give us new life. The living water is present with me now in his Spirit. And that means that there's an attainable progress for you. Like there's real hope that things can change. The more we take from him. I'm not going to earn this by trying. I'm going to give my effort in training, though. Do you see the difference? To really earn it by trying hard is different than to know I'm going to put in effort here and God is going to transform me. The Spirit of God is going to make me look more like Jesus. The invitation is to walk in this new identity as a child of God more than you have been. To take more steps. To be refreshed by trusting God in your next step. Come to the water that will give you life. It's Deuteronomy.